Welcome back to Bold Like a Leopard and the Razor Sharp News Report that's part of the Bold Like a Leopard channel. We're going to talk today about a few topics, not all of them related. We are going to talk about the Ukraine war and a lot of the war fatigue that's gone on, and the Nord Stream 2 pipeline revelation, and some other aspects of this whole theme. But I'm also going to wade into my opinion on some new YouTube drama, and this is regarding two creators that I've followed for a long time, Tim Pool and James O'Keefe. James O'Keefe really transcends YouTube entirely, but actually both of them would technically transcend it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and of course going to talk about the response to the State of the Union and all of the issues right now with the economy, given the news of the past month or so, the beginning of the year. So without further ado, let's talk about the YouTube drama first with Tim Pool, as well as the Project Veritas coup against James O'Keefe. Now, I want to make it clear that it's not really something most people will care about, and I'm sure that there's people who listen to this podcast who say that they could care less about either of these two personalities, right? So Tim Pool, if you don't know, is the creator of timcast.com, and he also, he's mainly known as a podcaster, but previously as a kind of an on-the-ground reporter, and he's built this small mini media empire out of his alternative news coverage. And James O'Keefe is the head of Project Veritas. So these two stories are not directly related, really. They're two separate stories, but I just wanted to comment on them, in close sequence to each other. James O'Keefe, of course, one of the more well-known investigative reporters of the last era, who does a lot of undercover sting investigations. So he's done recently a lot of investigations into Pfizer. He's done investigations of school districts and even private schools. And he's one of the journalists that I actually admire the most. So the controversies are actually pretty different. The controversy regarding Tim Pool is the fact that he has refused to really qualitatively comment on two stories that have significant touch in the alternative media space. Specifically, the issue of Eliza Blue. If you don't know who Eliza Blue is, she's this lady that has said for a while that she's a victim of human trafficking, and she's done a lot of activism on that part and public advocacy in order to expose human trafficking rings and in order to support victims. But the real problem is that she has encountered a lot of skepticism, and this probably centers around a recent case regarding Andrew Tate. Andrew Tate is, of course, much more famous probably than Tim Pool and Eliza Blue. He's a podcaster from Britain who became very well known as basically like the alpha dog of the manosphere and everything, and he has all of these very ostentatious and aggressive and hyper-masculine podcasts and everything. Well, Andrew Tate's been locked up in prison with his brother. I think his name is Tristan Tate, for about a month or so for what's been called human trafficking. However, the case has been steadily losing its luster as the witnesses don't really seem to back up any of the allegations, and in fact it's starting to look more of a stitch-up, like some sort of tin horn justice system's attempt to silence Andrew Tate, rather than a real case against human trafficking. Now, Andrew Tate, I don't want to get too far into the case. Andrew Tate, known person who engages in, he sells pornography. He basically has a cam girl business. So this isn't to defend everything that Andrew Tate does or says, but the controversy erupted from there, and Eliza Blue basically became one of the public advocates supporting some of the people who have accused Andrew Tate. this led to people digging into her past and basically accusing her of fabricating the notion that she's really a victim of human trafficking, and rather, I guess alleging that she is what would be called an amateur porn star, or not amateur porn star, but I guess an independent porn star, and maybe even a sex worker. That she's sold herself for money, and there's evidence through statements that she's made and different admissions that she's made about periods in her life, and therefore people are starting to close in on Eliza Blue. Now, one of the problems is that she happens to have a very strong connection at the moment, professional connection to Twitter, as one of the people within Elon Musk's team that has cracked down on grooming on Twitter and on child sex trafficking and child porn and everything. So the recent work that she's done has given her a lot of access and ability to influence who gets seen or not seen on Twitter. And therefore, a number of creators who have come out and criticized her, including Brittany Venti and Jeremy Hambley, usually known as the Quartering, they've been censored on Twitter. And the reason that this is impacting Tim Pool, who's really the person among all of the people I've mentioned that I listen to the most, is that he hasn't really commented on it. And when he does, and when he's finally been compelled to comment on it, it's usually to say, well, this isn't really his problem, and he's not going to really engage in this. It's not important enough of an issue. Now, the real reason that Tim Pool is being basically dragged kicking and screaming back and forth into this, and he's actually apologized now to Jeremy Hambley. I think it was a half-hearted apology, is because a lot of the people that are involved in this case, with the exception of Andrew Tate, have been on the Timcast podcast, the live show, Timcast IRL. It's a show that I listen to on replay. Usually every morning I listen to it as an audio podcast. It's not always that interesting, but Jeremy Hambley is a guy I've listened to for several years. He's always had very, I would say, insightful commentary on pop culture and entertainment, and sometimes even sports. So most of these people are people that I respect. I don't know that much about Brittany Venti. And then another person that's been, basically brought up in this context as being, in the middle of this issue is Elon Musk. Now, Musk himself is basically occupied with more important things at the moment, but I think the day will come when he'll probably realize that he gave too much power to Eliza Blue, and she's been exploiting it in order to settle scores and things like that. But the real problem is that Tim Pool has pretended that this isn't an issue, and that the people involved are really not that notable. Now, the problem with that is they've appeared on his show. Jeremy Hambley has appeared on his show, so has Eliza Blue, so has, I don't know about Brittany Venti, but another person who recently was disgraced, not totally connected to this issue, is Jack Murphy, who was exposed later for also engaging in some sort of freelance porn with I think it might have even been with his wife. And so all of these people have been basically cut off as being involved with Timcast IRL, and Tim Pool has tried to maintain this facade that it's not really that important. These are people that were just on the show. No, the reality is that Tim Pool, in his capacity as one of these big arbiters of what's really notable in the internet, the fact that he's had them on his show makes them important, at least insofar as he's concerned, right? What I would consider this to be, okay, some of you might be saying, well, can you at least make a point here? Tim Pool has gotten a little bit too big for his britches. That's the expression. He's basically lost perspective, and his success as a creator has made him look at issues that for a long time were core to why he's doing videos, and suddenly he's decided, well, all of these issues that I found so important for so long, free expression on the internet and on big tech platforms, suddenly I don't want to talk about them. Well, of course, a lot of his fans, people who have been on his channels, whether it's his his upload channels or his live channel, they now recognize that this is him basically admitting that he's jumped the shark, unfortunately. And I'm seriously considering just ceasing to listen to his shows. Now, it's not personal against him, and it's not as if I'm a big simp for Jeremy Hambley. I actually don't listen to his show very often, but Tim Pool has just had these ridiculous responses to this where he pretends that everybody's just coming for him because he's so because they just want to take his time up and waste it and everything, and that it's not really that big of an issue, and that the people who are negative are the problem and not him. No, that's not the issue. The issue is that he's not talking about an issue of internet censorship, something that's been happening within, I guess, a certain corner of the YouTube creator movement, and it's not only YouTube. For some reason, I keep only bringing that up, but it's YouTube, it's Twitter, it's all of the other video hosting sites, Twitch, if you wanna include that, and he's basically reneged on his commitment to, I don't know if it's a vocal commitment, but it's basically his career has been built around supporting free expression on the internet, and instead of covering this issue, which is at least giving it a little bit of analysis, even if he doesn't give a full opinion and state that, well, I don't really want to take a side on this, he's basically choosing to say, oh, it's not important because the people involved aren't really of public interest. Well, if they're not of public interest, then he should not have hosted them on his show. And I'm sad to say this wouldn't be the first time that there's been a creator out there that I've said has jumped the shark, and I simply am not going to listen to anymore because they've lost perspective on why their audience is even there. There was a guy named Lionel who I used to listen to all the time, and he has live streams every morning and everything, and he had a lot of very insightful stuff to say, especially given his past as an attorney, whether it's as a defense attorney or prosecuting attorney. Well, at a certain point, he stopped talking about the issues that drew me to the channel and started talking more about his vegan lifestyle and certain preferences and his taste in usually in like entertainment and things like that. And I suddenly started to realize that I don't care. And this isn't really the reason that I would be listening to his podcast of all of them. So I stopped. And that's really a problem for people who they get comfortable in a role and they lose perspective of why they're there. This is something that happened to Howard Stern and many of his fans who got to love his show because it was so irreverent and crass. They wouldn't recognize the Howard Stern of today if they listened to his show. I'm sure many of them have stopped listening because he really doesn't address anything that's really that shocking. He's no longer a shock jock. He's basically a stare at the clock jock. He's waiting to cash his check the next time it comes in. So I'm sorry to say this, but I think Tim Pool is losing his mojo. And I don't know if I'm going to continue to listen to any of his podcasts, but I'm not going to rule it out. I'm not one of his subscribers, like his paid subscribers, so it's not as if this is an issue of me feeling cheated as a subscriber or anything. Now, on to the other creator, James O'Keefe. This I actually feel stronger about. There's been an internal coup at Project Veritas where they basically removed him from day-to-day leadership, and I guess they're deciding whether he's going to have a role at all at the organization. And this has been reported by the Daily Beast, it's been reported by New York Magazine, both left of center or even far left publications. And my response to this is that the people who have decided to remove James O'Keefe are probably aware, and if they're not aware, then they're criminally incompetent, that removing James O'Keefe from Project Veritas would effectively mean the death knell of the organization. And O'Keefe has been so well known for building this enterprise from the ground up. Basically from his time, I think he was either a recent college graduate or he was still in college. He basically built it from just himself and a couple friends who were doing undercover camera stuff and leaking it to Andrew Breitbart and a few other conservative networks, to now being basically the most feared conservative investigative organization in the world. Maybe feared, I don't even know if I need to add the word conservative. And there's so many examples of people who have been exposed for being frauds or for doing things that were completely against the rules or illegal, that Project Veritas would not have been able to do without the vision of somebody like James O'Keefe, and his reputation stands behind him. Now, maybe it's not that imaginative of vision, and he in his books, I'm actually a major fan of James O'Keefe, and really the reason they removed him is because he's accused of being an abusive employer and things like that, which, it could be true, but regardless of whether it's true, the organization would be lost without him. And why would it be lost without him? Because he staked his reputation on backing up whistleblowers and telling them, we will make sure that we're not going to leave you out to dry. We're going to make sure that your issue, the one that you're exposing, is going to reach the airwaves, and people will know what misconduct is happening. And recently there were so many episodes of, and it's not really something that you can set your watch to. Exposés happen as they're discovered. You can't run an investigation according to a schedule, right? It's actually according to the schedule of the person you're trying to expose. And believe me, I've been involved, not to the degree that he has, but I've done investigative reporting of my own. And often it's a lot of waiting and seeing, and sometimes admitting that you're down a rabbit hole that has no end. It doesn't have any real anything to see on the other end. So I'm sorry to say, but that the organization will probably collapse without him. There was a recent investigation I wanted to note where they actually had a whistleblower from the Department of Health and Human Services that exposed human trafficking that was being facilitated by her department of migrants across the border, children, minors. And who do you think really drives that vision? Now, I get it. There's other people in the organization that probably have, contributed to it. But the person who was the mastermind of it, there's no doubt. And nobody is deluded into thinking that the group will remain the same if they simply name a different person to fill his position. In some sense, you don't even need a title for what James O'Keefe did. I mean, he was the founder. I don't know what other title he held, but really he was the architect. He was the maestro of whatever the organization did. And I'll say here, if they push him out, my hope is that he starts a new organization and that he succeeds. The fact is, I've tried to send stories to Project Veritas, never have had success with them picking it up. So, but I don't hold it against him, because really I don't know exactly what he was working on at the time, and also the revelations that he's brought to light since he has arrived on the scene are things that I've never had the resources or time to invest in it. It's really something that you have to take a leap of faith to accomplish, and it's really unfortunate what's going on. It's a huge setback for people who believe in what he's been doing and what Project Veritas as an organization has been doing. So that's out of the way. I felt it was important to address those two issues. Now on to the Ukraine-Russia conflict. So Seymour Hersh has alleged publicly that Nord Stream 2, the pipeline, was sabotaged by the United States deliberately through some sort of convoluted operation that included sending a signal to some, I guess you could call them limpet mines that were attached to the natural gas pipeline under the Baltic Sea. So it's an explosive revelation. It's not really given the due attention that it should, because the media, of course, doesn't care. Because the media does not care what is happening in the war in Ukraine and all the different issues that have cropped up as a result. And I think that if they, at this point, the evidence is here that these media companies that are choosing not to cover major accusations, like what's been made by Seymour Hersh, they're more interested in supporting supporting some sort of order that's in place, rather than actually telling the public anything of real use. Like if people are being told, well, Ukraine is under attack and Russia is about to, Russia is imperiling it and it's committing all of these crimes and brutalizing the Ukrainian people, all of which I concede are true, that's not really something that's useful to the public, because what more can they do? The U.S. has already committed a lot of war material and financial resources to supporting the war in Ukraine, and really, I'm going to talk about that in a minute too, but that's besides the point. But the real issue is, what are the events that are drawing the U.S. closer and closer into the war? There was a report I actually saw earlier that the U.S. is actually directing the Ukrainians on which targets to direct their HIMARS artillery. This is something that most Americans should be concerned about, because the idea was that we're going to support the war effort. It wasn't that we were going to direct it, right? Support and direction are two different things. And I know that there are people that may listen to this, and they're very supportive of the Ukrainian cause. I'm talking about, like, I know 3 people specifically that do know me, and they might even listen to the podcast, and they get really they get frustrated when I criticize the Ukrainian side. So you have to understand that what I'm also criticizing isn't just the Ukrainian government. It is the fact that it's not a transparent effort to the American people, and those that think, oh, this is something the American people aren't really going to be helped if this is transparent, because of course we need secrecy in the war effort. We need people we need operational security and all of that. Well, that's not really the way that the American public is able to hold their leaders accountable. This is one of the problems that happened in the war in Iraq and in the Vietnam War, and people get tired when you make the parallel, when you draw that parallel, but it is a true fact that Americans are roped into foreign conflicts over and over again, whether it is wars that we're directly involved in, like Vietnam and Iraq, or ones where we're basically directing from afar, like in Libya or Yemen, and there is no accountability. Resources are poured in, and years later it becomes revealed that really all it served was to prolong the war and cause more suffering. And I actually listened to, so this is why I think it's so important, Seymour Hersh's revelations and other revelations about America's opaque role in the war, where we're not being transparent to the American people. I actually listened to a debate the other day between Viva Fry and Konstantin Kisin, who's from the Trigonometry podcast. And it wasn't supposed to be a debate, but that's what it became. Basically, Viva Fry was on the more skeptical side. He was on the anti-war side, and Konstantin Kisin was on the pro-Ukraine side. And I think even a person who is more on the anti-war side would agree that Konstantin Kisin kicked his ass, because first of all, he's more knowledgeable as somebody who was born in Russia and who has studied the current conflict and the roots of it, and really a lot of the problems that Putin himself sowed in Ukraine, besides all the issues that have been brought up about what the West has done in Ukraine. Kisin had a greater handle on all the facts. He had a greater fact on how the war progressed. He also correctly asserted that the Russian statement that all they want to do is liberate the eastern portion of Ukraine is transparently false, because early in the war they attempted to capture Kiev. So you can't take anything that the Russians say at face value. Even if you are against the war, you have to either acknowledge the facts as they happen, which are that Russia, they bombed civilian infrastructure. They tried to do basically a blitzkrieg conquest of Ukraine, and whether they wanted to hold it or not is immaterial. They wanted to basically subdue Ukraine as a country and force them to accept whatever whatever situation Moscow would impose. So Konstantin Kisin destroyed his questioner in that debate. His questioner, Viva Frei, was simply ignorant of the real facts as they happened. But the real questions, this is something I'll probably go into depth with, hopefully in the next week or so. I'll actually try to analyze, hopefully, some segments of the debate. What he's failing to talk about is that much of the anti-war sentiment isn't about whether Russia is right or Ukraine is right, or Zelensky is an awful person, or the reality is that many of us are looking at this and seeing that the American government is manipulating the truth here. They're not being transparent with the American people. The financing of the war is clearly very suspect. Some of the weapons are turning up in other third world hotspots, meaning that the Ukrainian side is not really being, they're basically not competent enough often to keep a good handle on the war materials that we're sending to them. So sometimes these are very sophisticated technologies, not every single thing, but now they're asking for fighter planes. And the fact is that the U.S., whatever your feelings about the need of Ukraine to resist Russian aggression, right? And the U.S. has incompetently been, managing its resources throughout the war. We've had shortages throughout the war, and it may or may not be related to the war in Ukraine, but actually President Biden has said that a lot of it is really due to Putin. So that he's basically admitting, President Biden, that things like inflation are Vladimir Putin's fault. He's basically saying that Russia, a nation that isn't really our major economic partner, is causing inflation, right? And in the meantime, there have been baby food shortages. There have been issues of transit in terms of airlines, in terms of rail systems and rail strikes. All of these issues have erupted in the meantime. And yet, we're supposed to believe that the U.S. government is competently managing the effort to support Ukraine, and that everything is above board and there's no corruption involved. I don't think anyone on the anti-war side is really going to buy that, and many people in the middle are not going to buy that. Many people who support the war in Ukraine would probably have to admit that there's many open questions as to really where that money is going, whether the Ukrainians are actually taking the money and the resources, the military resources, and adequately using them. And when some of those arms turn up in other war zones, you have to start to wonder, are we basically doing the same thing we did in South Vietnam or in Pakistan? We're basically being the allies of a corrupt government that maybe they're helping us against a strategic enemy, but they're basically people that we should never hope to depend on. So that is really one of the criticisms that I don't think he has an answer for. It's basically like the best answer he could possibly have is what they used to say about Somoza, who was the dictator of Nicaragua, that he's, I think they said of him that he's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. So that would be the attitude that many people would have of Zelensky, and that would be the most neocon attitude that you could have. And ultimately, many of these regimes that neocons have either put into power or supported remaining in power have fallen in very catastrophic form. If you remember the Shah, if you remember Somoza, these are people that fell in the late 1970s under Carter, that simply were, they were just brutal guys that the U.S. was supporting because they were against the people that we're against, because they were against the Soviet Union or something. And those failures have to be assessed. You can't just say, well, we're going to support somebody because that's who there is. So that's one of the reasons that so many people are skeptical. Now, I did understand why Kissen, in that debate, he was pouring a lot of cold water on some of the people who call themselves the anti-imperialist left, because a lot of these idiots are not anti-imperialists. They're simply anti-American imperialism. Other countries, when they engage in imperialism, that's absolutely fine in their mind. So they're okay with Russia invading Ukraine and devastating it and reducing it to rubble. And by the way, that's the signal that there will be no winner of this war, because whoever controls Ukraine at the end will actually have to rebuild it. The people who do not control Ukraine will probably have a lot more military casualties. It actually might be that the loser of the war becomes the winner of the war by virtue of the simple fact that they don't have to try to rebuild Ukraine. If Russia even intends to rebuild it, they might just be destroying it for the sake of making an example out of them, which is pretty cruel. So the anti-imperialist left, as they call themselves, is largely made up of people who they have a rule of thumb that whoever America is for is the evil guy, and whoever America is against is a victim of imperialist expansion. And I'm not only talking about the left, by the way. There are people, including on the libertarian side, like the Ron Paul Institute, people that I respect in other ways, that they simply say, well, you shouldn't be criticizing these regimes because you're actually giving ground to the war hawks, the people that actually are encouraging real intervention in those countries. Well, here's what I say: you can't just just be oblivious to the facts that are inconvenient to you. Okay. When I was living in Israel, I was actually serving in the military there. There were many issues that were happening within the Israeli military that I thought were not really going to help win the war. When I was in the military, there was a war in Lebanon. There was a clear lack of connection between a lot of the commanders and the front, and this was one of the big criticisms, that people had been disconnected from some of the raw realities, that you couldn't win a war with air power and things like that. So there were issues that we were talking about at the time, and it was never considered treason, after the fact at least, to discuss the failures that were involved in the 2006 war in Lebanon, which I didn't really play a role in, but I was in the military at the time. So analyzing a war effort does not mean that I'm being, I'm stabbing my own side in the back. On the other hand, criticizing a war effort of the other side, it does not mean that I'm an imperialist, right? So when for example, I saw a tweet today where somebody was trying to say that, well, you must be a hypocrite if you're supporting Ukraine, but you're not supporting Palestine. So I posed the question, what if I don't support either one? So where does that put me? Because the real thing that she was trying to say was that you should support Palestine, but not support Ukraine. And the reality is that these are conditions that lead to that are the result of real logical fallacies. They're ones that say that, well, because you don't like this, you can't like this. This is one of the things where you'll hear people who talk about abortion this way. They'll be like, well, really, you don't care about life because life in the womb, because once they get out of the womb, you don't support Social Security, you don't support free health care, you don't support Head Start, you don't support all of the elements of the welfare state that keep that person, clothed and sheltered when they're actually born, right? So it's a false connection that they draw, because all they want to talk about is how you have to support one thing in order to support another, but they won't accept any nuance of the position. So that's one of the big criticisms I have of this whole Ukraine war coverage. And I think Seymour Hersh deserves a lot of credit. I don't know his personal stance on it, but the man has basically, and I'm open to the possibility that he's mistaken in the report. But at what point do we start to say that the U.S. government, the Pentagon, is often pulling the wool over the eyes of the people in order to tell them that we're doing the best job possible for you, so just trust us. You don't need to know where the money is going in Ukraine. You don't need to know to what extent the U.S. is involved in the war in Ukraine. All you have to do is know that we're on the right side and Putin is a bad man. That's not the way that the educated American citizen should relate to the war. So I'm back again, and we're going to talk now about the Biden State of the Union address. Now, it's really difficult to just focus on, or I guess, survey everything that is wrong with one speech that's so long and so full of deception as that speech was. So I will end up focusing on really one of the bigger issues that Biden has used as a cudgel as a result of this address. Now, the State of the Union itself, I think, is kind of a farce. Really, what are you doing there? It's like a ceremony where the president goes out and he pretends that he's working on behalf of the American people and basically sets out his goals and tries to basically compel Congress to join his side. And Biden isn't the only person who's had to deal with a hostile Congress and try to get them to sign on to some of the same goals as his. You probably know, if you've been a studier of a student of our history, for example, Reagan didn't really have a friendly Congress when he was president at all. He had Democratic majorities the entire time. I don't think Bush either had one. I'm saying Bush Sr. And Carter also, I believe he had Republican Senate majority for a little while. So presidents are used to having to basically go in front of a Congress that they know is somewhat against their agenda and try to convince them to get along with him. But Biden pursued a pretty ridiculous and over-the-top approach, which earned him, I guess, an over-the-top response by a lot of different Congress people, including Marjorie Taylor Greene, who James Carville actually called white trash, both because of her outfit and because of her outbursts during the State of the Union. Now, when I was in college, there was a State of the Union under Obama where decorum was broken, in the most dramatic fashion in years, when Joe Wilson, a Republican congressman from South Carolina, yelled out the phrase "you lie" when Obama was, I don't remember what issue he was talking about. I think it had to do with health insurance, but we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about Biden's big lie and basically why there is really no good news for the American people out of this speech, because and I'll explain it in a second. So Biden basically kept saying that there are Republicans who want to sunset the Social Security program and Medicare and other entitlement programs. And the truth of the matter is that he's right. There are Republicans that want to do it. Mike Lee, for example, was somebody who reacted as if it wasn't true, and it is. And Rick Scott is known to be someone who is in favor of sunsetting the program. And really the reason that I'm picking this as the most pernicious lie is because Biden is basically playing on the emotions of the American people, because Americans are taught to believe that they're entitled to the earnings that they put into Social Security and into Medicare, and that stuff is waiting for them for when they're going to retire and they're going to need it the most, and that it really is a betrayal of the American citizens, of the working people, when you threaten to change the system. And the truth of the matter is this, that Republicans are caught between a rock and a hard place. They can't openly attack Social Security and Medicare, because while both of those programs are incredibly insolvent and their costs are running away, and they're both going to be bankrupt in in very similar fashion, although on different tracks, Americans are conditioned to think that you can depend on them, when in reality, just like every entitlement program, it is going to, it will continue up until the moment when really the entire contraption falls apart, because all of the supporting pillars are basically rotting from out under it, right? This is basically like a device that's running out of fuel, that it eventually will start shaking and it'll either sputter to an end. If there's no oil in it, it'll basically overheat and explode. So you have the motor, right? You have the engine. Why is the car not running? Well, you didn't maintain it, and the cost of maintaining it is too much. That's basically what Social Security and Medicare are, because the reality is that, unlike what Americans think, the money that you pay into Social Security in your paycheck, it's deducted automatically for most Americans. I think for people who are contract employees, it isn't. But if you draw a W-2, like the majority, it is. Basically, they're not going to have anything left at a certain point, because the economy is going to be bankrupt. The Treasury is going to be bankrupt. We're not funding Social Security at a clip that is sufficient to replace the money that's being drawn out of it. And that's why with every campaign, there's some sort of scheme where they say we need to fully fund Social Security. Well, if you're paying into it your entire life, and so is everyone else around you, how come it isn't fully funded? Well, the answer is that you're not paying into Social Security. You're basically getting money deducted from your salary as your contribution to Social Security that's being put into the general fund of the U.S. Treasury. And they'll basically use it for whatever they want, whether it's in order to fund some stupid, experimental arts program at a college somewhere, or for some war in some godforsaken hellhole that you'll never be able to spell, let alone locate on the map. That is what they do with what supposedly you're paying into Social Security. And Social Security itself is drawing, the people who get Social Security, that's also drawing from the general fund. So really, the program itself is insolvent, because it isn't really a distinct program of the federal government. It is part of all of our spending profile. And as you know, we keep having to adjust the debt ceiling. We keep having to expand the money supply over and over again in order to fund this out of control spending. So that was the most dishonest portion of the State of the Union address, because Biden was basically behaving as if it is the Republicans that want to cut Social Security, and that is the bad thing. The reality is that Social Security is doomed no matter who's in power. The person who will allow it to go bankrupt on their watch will be left holding the bag. And in reality, the Democrats ought to be really wary of what's going to happen down the road when that actually comes to pass, right? When you have millions, maybe even hundreds of millions of Americans who reach retirement age, and the Social Security payouts simply are not there because the country itself has gone through some sort of default or an economic crisis. Well, what are they supposed to say? Are they going to say, well, it was the Republicans who, in their evil greed, they decided to cut Social Security? Well, the fact is that they've never been able to successfully cut Social Security and Medicare, to my knowledge. I wonder if they did it under President Bush, but they didn't do it under President Trump, even when they had majorities in both houses. And generally, Republicans are too chicken to do the right thing. Well, it's understandable why they're too chicken, because the media, because the society that we built around us since FDR introduced Social Security and some of the other programs back in the 1930s, we've been conditioned to think that Social Security is a given, that it's a betrayal of the public trust to do anything with it, when in reality, it was a contraption that should have never been brought into being. A lot of the reasons that Social Security has remained solvent for so many years is because of the strength of the U.S. economy relative to the rest of the world and our petrodollar world. All of that is falling apart. Maybe if it didn't fall apart, Social Security would have a longer future ahead. But the petrodollar is falling apart, so it could be that Social Security will run out of money sooner than it was expected. The number I've always heard from people, I think like the Cato Institute, which I'm not entirely in love with them, but the Cato Institute I think has predicted that Social Security will get insolvent in 2035. Well, this could happen much sooner, and all of this is really like a lot of these projections are made based on very static projections. Like things don't change, and maybe sometimes they account for inflation. Remember that Social Security payments are adjusted upward, or I don't think they're ever rolled back if there's deflation, which there never seems to be. But whenever there's an inflation in the economy, cost of living adjustments boost Social Security payments even higher. And since inflation has gotten more out of the control in the past 2 years than normal, we're talking about a bigger draw on the Treasury than before. So, that was my biggest takeaway from the State of the Union. Of course, there were many other moments that I thought were absurd, including his flubbing of the name of Tyree Nichols. He called him Tyler Nichols. This is the man who was beaten to death by Memphis cops, and people across both party lines and across beyond party lines, most people would acknowledge that was real police brutality. Well, somehow Biden was able to take an issue that everybody probably agreed on more or less and turn it into something that was an embarrassment for him. And this is all without getting into the issue of America's security in light of the Chinese surveillance balloon, in light of all of the issues regarding his own handling of classified information, which, conveniently he left out of the State of the Union address, understandably, but people ought to be really scared about the state of the country at this point, given who's in charge, and given the way that he basically is willing to manipulate any issue in order to remain in office, even though people know that he simply isn't, he's not fit for the job. So I did want to end this recording with basically a state of the world statement. And obviously I like to focus a little bit on the economy and on some of the news there. And it's hard to often recognize trends before they actually happen, so I'm not going to consider myself a clairvoyant. I'm like a lot of you. I'm playing catch up, and I'm reading a lot of books that I feel would have probably done me a lot of good 6 or 7 years ago when they came out. One of them is I'm reading right now, Crisis Economics by Nouriel Roubini, he's an economist. He's he's appeared on Bloomberg and things like that. But the one that I always recommend, that I think is the most effective, is Peter Schiff, who wrote The Real Crash. And then there's another one that I recommend by Jerry Robinson called Bankruptcy of Our Country. And really, that's the trajectory that I'm talking about. That's the state of the world and the nation, the state of the union. Our country is literally emptying out. Now, people still think that conditions are good because they can still find some of the things that are creature comforts of theirs. But I don't think it would be strange, if I observed, and because I think many of you would agree, that services have gone down. That when you buy a ticket on a flight, you don't get the same services that you used to. Now, the price may have gone up or gone down, but you certainly don't get the service for the base price that you used to if you're taking a flight. I don't fly very often, but from what I understand, you have to pay for everything, whether it's snacks or whether it's for any bags or anything. And maybe some of these were added years ago, but generally it's recognized that air travel has gotten consistently worse in the past few years. Well, you can add to that all of the other different things that are going into this economy, whether it is, the shrinkflation in terms of products that are out there, whether it is, how much you are expected to tip, right? So you're probably tipping more now because your bill is higher whenever you go out to the restaurant. Yesterday, we went out to the restaurant. I'm not going to tell you how much I paid. But anyway, there's it was a pretty pricey restaurant, to be honest with you, but we had to try it out. Anyway, the point that I'm trying to make is that people are still feeling the effects of the inflated economy, but this economy is not going to remain inflated. The deflation and the process of which this economy goes back to its real state, because inflation is really a delusion based on an estimated value of certain items. That process is going to be painful because people will start to realize that things that they bought are not worth as much when they sell it. And they really don't have, first they're not going to have the purchasing power that they used to, so their savings are going to be worth less. So they're going to be selling a lot of the things that they own. And this is always really evident in the housing market. When people try to put a house on the market that they invested a lot of money in, and then they try to list it again, and they're not able to find buyers, not only that are at the price that they were hoping to get back in order to make a profit on their investment, in many cases they're not able to recoup the cost that they put into the house. That's where all these underwater mortgages came from. People who are stuck with mortgages on houses that are not worth the value of their loan. And that was an inflationary process. Those properties went to the roof, they went to the moon, and eventually they had to come back to earth. That's really where the country is finding itself, and nothing could be more evident than in the tech sector, where layoffs are just ballooning. Not just tech, but entertainment too. Disney is laying off, if I'm not mistaken, 7,000 workers. Yahoo announced major layoffs today. Zoom announced major layoffs earlier this week. So the employment market for many of these businesses, some of them older, right? Disney isn't very new, but many of their products are newer, right? So Disney Plus is newer, and some of their products are not really in traditional filmmaking. They're more in modern entertainment, and of course they have hotel and hospitality, and they have ESPN and things like that. So Disney's model has turned into an absolute nightmare. But even with Bob Iger back as the CEO, and Zoom, of course, is coming back to earth in the wake of the end of the pandemic. People are going back to work because employers are realizing that they can't hold people accountable for stuff they're supposed to do if they're always, just attending via Zoom. It's easier to hold people accountable when they're in the office. So Zoom has released a lot of employees, and Yahoo, I believe, I don't know if I mentioned this already, but Yahoo is making a major, I think they said a 20% cut by the end of the year of employment. So this should be scary. This isn't something like I know some of the people that are getting laid off, I probably would not get along with. And so you would expect me to have a little bit of schadenfreude here. And I'm not going to lie, maybe in some cases, if I find out what some of these people have said about people like me, yeah, I'll have a little bit of schadenfreude. But really, the truth is that this should be a wake-up call for all Americans. The state of the world, the state of the union, the state of the country is crisis mode. We're talking about people who are in a slow motion devolution from having the most prosperous economy in the world, the best, the best living conditions that people have ever had, and often too many perks, too many, I would say, goodies that people have, all these different varieties of treats and sodas and things like that. Well, a lot of that may disappear in the future. I've talked to a friend of mine who's a supply chain guy, and during the big supply chain crisis, he was saying, well, you're not going to see bare shelves necessarily, but you will see a contraction in variety. And this is a guy who is no doomsayer. He usually tries to wave off any warnings that we say, but he works for a major international food production company, and he says to us, yeah, this is a crisis that isn't going to it's not going to be a passing issue. You're going to see certain things that you were used to disappear. And basically what I'll tell you is, if you want to see the future of America, the way that on the course that we're headed, I would recommend that you take a flight, okay, if you have the money to do it, and this is a worthy investment of yours and you need convincing, fly over to the UK and take a train to one of the northern towns. I think Manchester is in the north. I'm not good with British geography, but Manchester, Liverpool, maybe Birmingham, and but any of the towns of Yorkshire and Lancashire that are former industrial towns that have basically rotted and fallen apart, well, they started to really fall apart back in the 40s and 50s when the UK lost its status as the reserve currency of the world. That's the future that we have to expect. And unfortunately, it's a State of the Union that no president would be willing to lay out for the American people. That's about it. Please like, share, and subscribe. Also, subscribe to me on all the different social media and video hosting sites and my newsletter. They're all in the link tree below, including Rumble, BitChute, and Odyssey. And I'll talk to you later.